Well, if you've been following the news in the last little bit, you'll understand that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head and the chief financier of the mercenary group Wagner in Russia, had himself quite a week, particularly last weekend. But it wasn't just the weekend, he's still having himself a week, and I would think that his future isn't as solid as he might hope that it was. But anyways, let's get back to last weekend and what happened to start all this off. I shouldn't really say it's what started it all off, because it really had its genesis a little earlier in the relationship that Prigozhin has with the top of the military structure in Russia. And that particularly would be the conflict that he has with the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, who is not a military man, never served in the army, he's a political hack. And the other fellow who's a real general, that would be the Chief of the General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov. Now, Prigozhin has had a problem with both of these guys ever since Russia walked into Ukraine. Wagner, which is an independent military group, now mind you, it's financed by the Russians. The relationship between the two is rather murky, but there is a definite connection between Russia itself, or Putin himself, and the Wagner group. Remember that Prigozhin used to be one of Putin's loyal subordinates, and one of the guys who got himself fabulously wealthy as a result of Putin's hold on power in Russia. So, what went wrong? Wagner has been one of the most effective fighting forces for the Russians in Ukraine, and that's to say something, because the Russians haven't been very effective at all. Basically, they've been getting their ass kicked ever since they set foot in Ukraine. But some silver lining is there, and that's the response of Wagner, particularly in the area of Bakhmut. Bakhmut, by itself, it's a city in Ukraine, but it's not really terribly strategic for any particular reason. But it sort of developed into a modern-day Stalingrad, where both sides went at it hammer and tong in this city for the longest time, for months and months and months, until finally Wagner was able to take control of the city proper. Now that doesn't mean that they took the entire Bakhmut area, but they were able to grab the urban area after months and months and months of heavy fighting and taking tens of thousands of casualties in the process. Well, during all of this, Prigozhin got into a big argument with Shoigu in particular, and Gerasimov as well, over the supply of ammunition and arms to Wagner from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, Prigozhin had accused those two of trying to undermine Wagner by failing to give the mercenaries the kind of weaponry and, of course, the volume of ammunition that they needed in their fight against the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. And so Prigozhin started to get the idea in his mind, it started kicking around in the back of his head, that these two guys, possibly even at the behest of Putin himself, were undertaking a campaign to not only undermine Wagner, but to possibly even in the long term destroy Wagner, given that Wagner is a battle-hardened force. I mean, the total number of Wagner mercenaries worldwide is somewhere in the area of 70 to 80,000 men. They've been involved in Africa, they were involved in Syria, and they've been involved, of course, in Ukraine. And they have emerged as being some of the Russians' best troops in that conflict with Ukraine. So they are viewed somewhat suspiciously by the Russian military. They are viewed, I mean, listen, they're an armed force independent of the Russian military, possibly with connections to Putin himself, possibly with connections to the Siloviki, which of course is the Russian elite. So for the Ministry of Defense or for any other interior security forces that exist in Russia, Wagner represents a sort of threat to them and to the overall stability of Putin's regime. So Prigozhin was very suspicious that these guys were getting together to have conversations to see about diminishing Wagner or defeating it outright and eliminating it as a possible threat. So Prigozhin has been extremely negative in his commentary. He has been saying stuff about the Russian war effort, and in particular the Ministry of Defense, that would, I mean, a regular Russian on the street, questioning the validity of the war in the first place could find themselves in jail for 15 years, and I'm not kidding there. And yet Prigozhin is saying stuff that's almost bordering on treason, if you look at it. And you know, as time will go by, you will see Putin actually accuse him of treason without mentioning his name, mind you, but still it's unmistakable who Putin is talking about. Okay, so nevertheless, Prigozhin has these profanity-laden criticisms of Shoigu and Gerasimov and senior Russian military commanders, accusing them of corruption, accusing them of incompetence, criticizing them and leveling charges that they don't know what they're doing, and that they gave misleading advice to Putin himself prior to the invasion that made Putin think that when the Russians walked into Ukraine that they were going to be met with Ukrainians lining the sides of the road, throwing flowers and just being exultant at the appearance of Russian troops to save them from the Nazism of the Ukrainian regime of Vladimir Zelensky. But as the Russians found out very soon after they entered Ukraine, that was the exact opposite of the reception that they got. The Ukrainians dug in, they fought back, and mind you, this was before the West started feeding them large amounts of military equipment, ammunition, and so forth. So the Ukrainians really dug in, and they managed to roll things back and actually turn the Russians back and take back some of the territory, not all, mind you, but some of the territory that the Russians had taken in the early going of the invasion. So, Prigozhin is, as I said, he was accusing the Russian military of providing Putin with information that perhaps he was more likely wanting to hear. From what I understand of Putin's leadership style, he's the kind of guy that really doesn't want to listen to you if you have any kind of advice or views or information that sort of runs contrary to what he already thinks. And so what that leads to is a situation where, he's not making decisions based upon valid military intelligence and overall intelligence. He's making decisions based upon results that he's already formulated in his mind that already fit his preconceived narrative of the way things should go in Ukraine. So, Prigozhin, this past weekend, I think it was around Friday, it must have been Friday, and he got it into his head that Gerasimov and Shoigu had a meeting together, and as a result of that meeting, they agreed to collaborate together to try and bring about the demise of Wagner. So at the end of the meeting, so thought Prigozhin, and perhaps he's correct, Gerasimov undertook to use Russian aviation and Russian artillery to hit Wagner columns as they extricated themselves from the front. The fight for Bakhmut is over, so Wagner was being brought back to the rear for rest and refit. Supposedly, that's the way real militaries work. And it was determined as a result of this meeting, in Prigozhin's opinion, it was decided that they were going to catch Wagner while they were vulnerable, and to hit them with artillery and aviation and those sorts of things. So that got up Prigozhin's butt a little bit, understandably, to be attacked by friendly fire. And so he decided to take matters into his own hands here. I mean, all the criticism over all of the months that never led to anything. Putin never did anything about this criticism towards Shoigu and Gerasimov. It really must have made those two feel that they were just sort of twisting in the wind, not really having the support of Putin, at least publicly, in the face of the criticism from Prigozhin. So, and that's the way Putin plays his game. He sort of got a little Joseph Stalin in him. Just Stalin used to pit all his generals against one another to see who would emerge the strongest or who would survive that exercise. So he would always have a little bit of a competition, and he'd stand back and watch them sort of fight with each other to see who would get the table scraps off Stalin's table. So Putin, who sort of imagines himself as one of these great historical Russian figures himself, plays that game as well. So he never offered any public, anyways, criticism of Prigozhin's contents, and it must have made Shoigu and Gerasimov feel very vulnerable indeed. Remember, this is Russia, where you never know. This is Russia, where stabbing somebody in the back is just another phrase that is Saturday night. That's something that it's almost a cultural thing for them over there. But anyways, it couldn't have made Shoigu and Gerasimov feel very secure about their positions. So back to Prigozhin and last weekend. So what does he do in the face of these attacks that allegedly took place on his fighters from the Russian military? So what he does is he gathers about 25,000 of his men, and he crosses the border from Ukraine into Russia. So, I mean, to all intents and purposes, this is an invasion of Russia. Now, mind you, there's no 25,000 soldiers ever made that are going to walk into Russia and occupy the place. It's just not going to happen. But 25,000 soldiers is enough to march on the next nearest Russian city of any note, and that would be Rostov-on-Don, which just happens to be the command and control center of the entire Russian military effort in Ukraine. So Prigozhin rolls in on Rostov-on-Don, and he is met with absolutely zero resistance. There is nothing. They take Rostov-on-Don without a shot. In fact, the citizens of the place are lining the streets, and they're waving and hooting and hollering and taking pictures and taking selfies with Wagner mercenaries, taking pictures with Prigozhin himself, who has become rather a populist against the elites of Russia, of which Gerasimov and Shoigu would be considered to be members of. So what an embarrassing situation for the Kremlin. I mean, it's like a stab in the back from one of their own. They never really considered that Prigozhin would do something like this in an attempt I suppose his attempt is to try and get Shoigu and Gerasimov sacked, to get them replaced. He said it wasn't an invasion. He said it was a march of justice. And I guess that's the justice he's looking for, not to cause problems for Putin, not to overthrow Putin's regime, but to force Putin to get rid of Shoigu and Gerasimov. So, as I said, he walks into Rostov-on-Don. Very embarrassing for the Russians generally. Very embarrassing for Vladimir Putin specifically. So, that's Friday night. And then we get into Saturday, and then we start hearing news reports of Wagner forces being in another larger Russian city, Voronezh, which is up the M4 highway from Rostov-on-Don and roughly about halfway between Rostov-on-Don and Moscow itself, which is the capital city of Russia and the home of the Kremlin, as you know. And again, it's the same story. Wagner just rolls into Voronezh without any opposition. And they roll in and they take the place, and if it was embarrassing before, it's humiliating now. Because the Russians don't have anything to stop them. All of the Russian forces are in Ukraine, getting their asses kicked. There's nothing but grandpas and babushkas that stand in the way of Wagner here. And even some Russian military units and police units that were sent to oppose Wagner either took off at the approach of Wagner. Some of them may have joined Wagner, but they didn't get in the way and exchange too much combat power with Wagner. I guess survival is a pretty keen instinct in Russia, and these guys knew that the situation wasn't really good to stand their ground, so they melted away fairly quickly and fairly easily. So now Wagner forces are in Voronezh, and So that's all well and good. I mean, they're only measured in a couple dozen thousands. Like I said, it's not like they're going to take Russia or anything, but they're causing quite a stir, and the stir is mostly as a result of the Russians can do nothing to stop them. So then we start hearing news reports of Wagner columns of heavy equipment and troops and trucks and armored personnel carriers and anti-aircraft systems and artillery systems and the whole whack of it rolling up the M4 highway towards Moscow itself. And these guys get to within about 150 miles of Moscow. Now, it's been a long time since a hostile military force has approached Moscow. The last time I can remember was in the failed coup of 1991. And then prior to that, I think I have to go all the way back to 1941 when Hitler made it to within the last subway stop of the Russian subway system, where he could actually see Red Square off in the distance. Not Hitler himself, but the German troops that were the leading element of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Kremlin and Moscow generally has not been in this level of panic since those two events. Okay, so there's orders that go out to blow up the roads, to send heavy equipment to dig up the roads, to impede the progress of Wagner as they use these roads, to put anti-tank ditches around Moscow, to do the very best that they can to offer up obstacles to get in the way of Wagner, because they're obviously afraid that Wagner's going to roll right into Moscow itself. So this level of panic is very noteworthy, and as I said before, there's no 25,000 guys, and this column of Wagner guys doesn't have 25,000 guys. It's just part of the 25,000. So it might even be in the area of 5,000 guys. So there's no 5,000 guys who are going to walk into Moscow, a city of several million people, and take over anything, much less a McDonald's. But even that's impossible because McDonald's bugged out of the country at the start of the war. So it would be more symbolic than anything else. So I suppose Prigozhin probably thought that he had support from some powerful elements in Russian society. Perhaps members of the Siloviki, which of course he is a member of. That's an organization or a group of people who represent the elites of Russia, of which Putin would be considered to be the top dog. Maybe he thought that some of those people were going to rally to his colors. Maybe he thought that there were some Russian military units that were going to join him along the way to Moscow. I mean, maybe he thought of himself as a modern-day Napoleon. If you recall, Napoleon was exiled on Elba, an island, after all the problems that he caused in Europe in the years previous. But he got a little antsy and he decided he was going to make a big comeback. And he showed up on the shores of southern France with his ragtag grouping of supporters. And the entire French army was sitting there waiting for him. And he addresses them, and the next thing you know, the entire French army switches sides and joins Napoleon against their king, which they swore an oath of loyalty to. And that worked out just fine for Napoleon, who marched all the way to Paris and took power. And well, that lasted until the Battle of Waterloo, which kind of settled the Napoleon thing once and for all. Anyways, back to Prigozhin. He probably thought that was going to happen with him, where people were just going to join him, and together they were en masse going to move towards the capital and force some changes, perhaps in the Kremlin itself, but certainly to leverage some changes to get Shoigu and Gerasimov sacked by Putin himself. So, it didn't work out all that well. As Saturday turned to Sunday, then the news reports started to report that the Wagner column had stopped. In fact, it had more than stopped, it had turned around. So, what's going on here? I mean, we over in the West, or I'll speak for myself, we're sitting here actually, I have no love for Yevgeny Prigozhin, but I'm sitting here like, yeah, if I have to take a side, I'm going to be cheering for him. If he causes any discomfort or any problems or any panic or any negativity whatsoever in the Russian leadership, I say, good for you. You may be a detestable war criminal, but if I had a choice between a group of detestable war criminals, well, right now I'm cheering for you. In the end, I hope you all end up losers. But yeah, I mean, as the Russians are fighting amongst themselves, can't be anything but good news for the rest of us.